Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Throttling Overview for Finance and Operations Integrations. My name is Nina, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. By participating in this session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of the recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have any questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions during today's presentation, and there will be time at the end for further questions. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now on to the presentation. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Sunil Garg, Principal Group Program Manager, Hitham Syed, Senior Program Manager, Raul Agarwal, Architect, and Sunil, over to you.
Thanks, and good morning and good evening, everyone. First off, thank you for taking the time to join us for this session. So today with me is Rahul Agarwal and Hitham Syed and myself, Sunil Garg, and we are going to cover the topic of throttling in finance and operations, which is a new capability that is getting previewed in Platform Update 37 shortly. So Hitham, can you switch to the slide? So from an agenda perspective, we will first spend some time talking about the current set of challenges and why throttling was even conceived and why we have been working on this functionality. And we will go into the details of how throttling will work, so we'll understand how throttling has been implemented. And equally important will be for us to understand what throttling is not going to do for us and what throttling is not. And then we'll switch over to a quick demo to show you what is going to be there in Platform Update 37. And then we'll wrap up by talking about some action items that we all have to take notes on and follow up going forward. And then we'll open up for Q&A. So with that, when we look at our current set of challenges, which I'm sure all of us are very familiar with, this should be not a surprise to any of us. We oftentimes run into situations where, at least from an integrations perspective, whether it is OData integrations or custom services integrations, we oftentimes start seeing behaviors that are random in nature in terms of failures. We start seeing issues related to system slowness, which also affects other online users in some cases. So after looking at the various flavors of such issues over time, what is the common denominator across all these kinds of issues is the fact that the environment, the system has a finite set of resources. And the finite set of resources is a common pool of resources that is catering to integrations, that is catering to online user sessions, that is catering to all the other scenarios and business transactions that are operating and executing on that environment. And as a result, what happens is if the system is subjected, if the environment is subjected to overutilization of these resources, then the user experience, integrations, the scenarios, and all of that starts to get impacted in a negative way. And that is where we start thinking about, okay, how can we avoid such a thing to happen to begin with? And then when we take a step back and start thinking about how was the environment even provisioned, then we go back to the sizing that was done during the environment planning stages of the implementation. And we all try to fill in the sizing sheet to the best of our knowledge in terms of expectations of what the transaction volume might be today, 6 months from now, 12 months from now. What are the kind of workloads that we anticipate in the environment that will be subjected to traffic? And based on that sizing information that is input into the sheet, the environment is sized, and then the system goes live. However, as we all know, again, more often than not, what was planned from a traffic and load perspective is oftentimes different from the reality. It could be as planned for the initial few months of go live, but as time progresses, as businesses expand, the number of transactions, the load, the pattern of traffic that comes into the environment also changes and evolves. And 9 out of 10 times, it is always more than what the environment was sized for. So that being the case, we should always expect at some point in the life cycle of the environment, it is going to get subjected to overutilization of resources. And in such a case, what can we do in terms of proactively trying to avoid at least preventing random failures of integrations, which might be difficult to even investigate? How can we prevent user experience deterioration for users that are interacting with the system through the user interface itself? And all of a sudden the system stops to respond, or systems become super slow. How can we prevent all these lack of experiences, if you will, and how can we make sure that integrations are still running smoothly without impacting any other usage of the system? The other aspect of it, what we talk now is purely from a F&O perspective, what happens in the environment and how the users and integrations are affected coming into the environment. But the other side is the clients, the integration clients that are actually sending requests and getting information from F&O through OData or custom services, for example. And when the client sees a timeout, or when the client sees a failure that this request did not actually go through, more often than not, every client implements some sort of a retry mechanics. And what happens is the first request that came in that got timed out or that got failed, let's take the example of timeout, that got timed out because the system was busy and overutilized already, and hence it could not get back and process the request within time. The client is going to send the request again because there is some retry logic that every client implements. And then what happens is, if this continues for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, then all of a sudden we start seeing the same request running multiple times on the environment, which even leads to sometimes exponential deterioration of the overall situation, which was anyways bad to begin with. So these are the challenges today, and the complaints that we get, the support cases that you all log for us to take a look at, and the pain that all of you go through in this context is not surprising. And this is the overall landscape we are in, which actually, that is the reason why we started working on throttling as a mechanics to actually help the situation and to try and prevent this from even happening. So now let's understand what throttling is going to do for us. We all understand what throttling is. It is not a new concept, but we want to understand how it is implemented in finance and operations and what were the objectives of such an implementation. Again, to take a step back, I think we kind of went through this process. I mean, everything starts from a sizing exercise to size the environment to the best of our knowledge. And then the environments get provisioned, and then businesses go live and transactions starts happening. And as we talked about it, over time, the usage of the system starts to vary and deviate from how it was envisioned and planned to be utilized. And as a result, overutilization of systems starts to show up, more often than not. And that is when, we want to step in and help and make sure that the system is at least responsive and it is not getting into a state where everyone, whether it is integrations or users interacting with the systems, are unable to get anything done in the system. So that is where the throttling functionality comes into play. And the first piece of the throttling functionality is, we took a bottoms-up approach, which is how can we know to begin with that throttling is happening and throttling must be done? How can, as a customer, as a user, you can know that this is my workload pattern, and yes, I can see that at some point throttling can happen to my workload. Because unless and until that understanding is there about our workloads, how the traffic pattern is, it becomes difficult to actually determine what the throttling behavior is going to be and how is that going to impact, if at all, from an integrations perspective. So that is where the monitoring aspect comes into play, where, as we will see in the demo, in LCS, you will be able to go and start looking at the telemetry, the data that will help us understand what is the traffic on the system from an OData and custom services perspective, and what would the system have done. It's like a simulation, for example. Would the system have throttled these OData calls, these custom services calls? Yes or no? So that understanding, that information will be available in LCS, and that is the first step for us to start looking at so that we understand our own workloads as to this is the rate at which the calls come in. OData calls are more than custom services, for example. The OData calls are, high throughput during this time of the day versus the other times of the day, for example. So understanding that pattern is important so that other decisions can be made as far as throttling is concerned, which we will talk about. So once that understanding is established, then the next step is to configure throttling itself based on the priority of the integrations. So we'll spend some time talking about what is priority-based throttling is. At a very high level, what this means is if the system is unable to process any more requests, then it has to throttle. Now, should the system start throttling requests as they come in, like first come, first serve, or should there be some intelligence in the system where, as a user, we can go and tell the system that out of my 20 integrations that I have, 15 are OData, 5 are custom services, and I am assigning priority of low, medium, or high to these integrations so that in case you have to throttle my integrations, then don't just throttle based on whichever request comes next, but rather start to throttle based on the priority, which means if the system has to start throttling, it will throttle the low priority integrations first and then medium. And still, if the system is subjected to high traffic and it is going to hit the max threshold, it will start throttling the higher priority integrations at that point in time. So this comes in, very handy from a business criticality perspective. Like, for example, during the month end, last week of the month, or the last week and the first week of the months, when month-end processing is happening, certain OData calls needs to be high priority. As for example, if users are interacting with Excel import export, for example, using Excel add-in, that behind the scene is OData. So if there are accountants that are going to do that time and again every month at the end of the month, then it can be configured to say that these users need to be prioritized over my other integration because I don't want them to be subjected to any throttling as they are going through their critical month-end processing, for example, right? So that logic can be applied across the board, and that is where the business critical nature comes in, and that is where the mapping to high, medium, and low priority comes into play, which we will see how that surfaces in the configuration itself. So once we have understood the patterns, the traffic, the workload, and once we have determined the priorities, we have configured the priority for throttling. Throttling is enabled, right? I mean, at that point, it's a matter of system getting into certain thresholds, and if there is more requests coming in, the system will start to throttle. When the system starts to throttle, what happens is the system will send back a 429 to the client saying that, sorry, this request cannot be processed right now. Instead, can you please resend this request after X minutes of time? So that information will be there in the 429 itself, which the client can use in the retry logic. But instead of retrying right away or having some custom wait time, the client can use the time that was suggested by FNO in the 429, and the client can retry that request after that amount of time. And the time that the wait time that comes in 429 is a dynamically calculated value based on the system load at that point in time. So it is not a hard-coded static value. It will keep changing based on how the load is on the system at any given point in time. So the expectation is once the client starts to use the 429s and respond as expected, then we should be able to prevent any degradation of service, both to integration scenarios and also for online users, because the system will now be able to maintain hygiene. The system will be able to preserve the responsiveness and sanity of itself because it is able to gatekeep and prevent requests from overwhelming the system itself. So that is the high level rundown of what throttling is going to do for us in finance and operations. Next slide, Ritam. So equally important for us to understand is what is not throttling, right? I think the first and the foremost thing for us to understand is throttling is not enforcing any API rate limits, right? Throttling is not here to say that, sorry, you are sending 100 requests per hour or 100 requests per minute. You cannot do that anymore. That is not the objective of throttling. That is not the intent of throttling. Because to begin with, we have not told you what should be the maximum throughput that you should be sending into the system, right? If we had given that guidelines and if we had published those, then we can have that conversation, which is, okay, these are the published guidelines, and if there is more requests coming in, then the system will throttle. But in the absence of that guidance that we have not given our users and customers, the objective of throttling is not to do any kind of rate limit, but the objective of throttling is to make sure that whatever SLA was promised and whatever the environment was sized for, the environment is usable in a reasonable manner all the time for integrations and also for online sessions. And when we talk about integrations, we are specifically talking about OData and Custom Services, because this is where the throttling has been implemented as of now. DIXF is not subjected to throttling as of now. We want to learn through this process with all of you and then take the feedback and then see how can we enable that for DIXF going forward sometime in future. Also, throttling is not a solution for a bad design of integrations in general, whether it is a data entity design issue or some other design issue in the code. I mean, throttling is not going to solve that, which means if there is a slow query that always is executing slow for this specific request or for this specific entity, I mean, there is some problem with that entity itself or somewhere in that design that needs to be addressed, regardless of throttling trying to still preserve the system sanity, right? So throttling is not a solution for bad entity design or bad integration design in general, but throttling is there to prevent the system from getting crippled for various reasons. Now, if we move on to the next slide. So this is the throttling configuration that we have been talking about, and this is something Haitham will show in the demo as well. Basically, the idea is today in FNO, you are able to go and configure the integration in the Azure application configuration form in FNO, where you can go and say that this is my AAD app ID, and this is mapping to this user, so that FNO can authorize that incoming request based on that configuration. What the form that we are seeing right now is basically a form that is going to use information from that configuration. And then on top of that, it allows us to assign priority of low, medium, and high. And this becomes the input to the throttling engine, which will use to throttle when situation demands that throttling has to happen. And the way the throttling logic will kick in is, there are thresholds that are built into the throttling engine. And when the low threshold, when the system is nearing the low threshold and it has touched the low threshold, it will start to throttle low priority integrations. And at that point, if there are high priority and medium priority requests coming in, it is going to allow that to go in and it will be processed, which can result in the system utilization increasing, and it might hit the next threshold, which is the medium threshold, at which point low priority and medium priority will start getting throttled while the high priority can still come in and get processed. Now, those can still result in pushing the system even more further towards reaching the high priority or the high threshold, at which point any request, OData and custom services coming in will start getting throttled. So that's kind of the high level logic of how the throttling is going to work. Now, yes, one can go and set all integrations to high priority to game the system, but that is not going to meet the objectives for why throttling is there. So we will not be realizing the benefits of throttling if we just go and configure everything as high, because at that point in time, we are always subjecting the system to reach the high threshold, which may not be desirable at any point in time. Can we switch slides? Yeah, so Haitham, I'll hand off to Haitham for a quick demo, and then we can come back to the slides.
Thank you, Sunil. So, hello, everyone. I'm gonna take you through a quick demo on how to configure the priorities and how would the experience look like. So if I log into my FNO, to set up any integration, I have to first register my application in the Azure Active Directory application. And this is usually when I enter and set up my client ID, and I assign a name, and then I assign the user ID that will come with this, was assigned with this integration. Then once I complete my setup, this is what we call an app, Azure AD app-based integrations. And as Sunil mentioned, there is another type of integrations like the Excel, for example, which is use OData, and this doesn't require any registration, and this is considered as a user-based integration. Once I have completed my setup, I would go again, and I will go to throttling priority mapping, and I can go to this from my system administration menu as well, and it will be the throttling priority 4. Here, I would have to assign a priority to my app ID defined already in the Azure Active Directory or to my user ID. Once I select my authentication type, I would be able to select directly from the Azure AD table, or if I would select a user, I would be able to select a user defined already in my users table. And then based on that, I will assign high, medium, low priority based on my business scenario or based on the type of process I'm doing. Like, for example, as we mentioned before, at the end of the month, at specific operations, I can assign those priorities. And then once the business starts, and based on the health of the system, the throttling manager will be able to determine the health state and will start throttling the request, honoring the priorities defined here. For system admins to be able to access this particular form, also we have created a security role that if you don't want to assign system admin role to a specific user, you can just assign the throttling manager, configuration manager to this particular user, so they can just maintain the configuration of the priorities. And also, once the throttling will happen, I can go to my environment monitoring in LCS. And if I go to the activity and row logs, I can simply select the query all throttling events. I can put my start date and end date, and then I can search for my throttling events. And we have simulated a test of an integration. And as we have seen, like the first request with the medium priority when throttling kicked in has been throttled. And then the rest of the requests are not being throttled due to a specific retry or due to a higher priority. And by doing so, I would be able to analyze the data more to see whether I need to adjust my priorities, what type of integration I would add a retry, those sort of like answers I need to answer based on my analysis of this pattern. That concludes the part of the experience, and I will go back to the slides and back to Sunil. Thank you.
Thanks, Aitam. So before we jump into Q&A, let's summarize and try to understand the call to action. Basically, these are some of the logical steps that we should be thinking about starting now. And in that process, as we said, platform update 37, which tentatively will be available in PEAP early August, give or take a week or so, but tentatively early August. So that is when throttling will be available as a preview. And, we should all start to look into it, start playing with it, understand how it practically works, and basically, give us feedback. However, from a planning perspective, how can one plan to enable throttling in production? The first step will be to, once platform update 37 is in production, to basically start monitoring the workloads and understanding the workload patterns using the report in LCS that Haitham showed, right? So there is no throttling at this point in time. Things continue to be the way it is, but there is still a report that is available in LCS that will, you can think of that as a simulation report that shows you if throttling were enabled, how throttling would have happened, which requests would have got throttled, and which requests would have gone through. So that report becomes important as a first step for us to understand and monitor our own workloads. And that should help us to, again, have conversations amongst yourself, within your team, your business, to basically identify the critical nature of these integrations and determine which ones are going to be qualified as low versus medium versus high. Once that understanding is arrived at, then you can basically configure throttling in one of the test environments, and you can enable it for testing. You can subject the same kind of traffic and load to that test environment, and that is when throttling will happen for real, because you have configured throttling. You have configured the priority for those throttling. And when throttling happens in the test environment, you can again use the LCS report to actually see the results of the real throttling. And if there is any fine tune-up required, you can tweak that. And that is the learning process, learning phase of how throttling might be configured finally in production. Now, this is also the phase where the integration clients needs to be updated to respond to 429s in a manner we discussed earlier. And once those clients are updated, you can go through that testing and validation process. And once that is all completed, then the throttling can be configured the way it was tested in production. And once production is configured for throttling, then throttling will start happening as we discussed, based on the load and the system resources and whatnot. Now, this is the recommended process between now and April 2021, which is almost 10 months that we have. But if for some reason any environment, any production environment has not yet configured throttling, then starting April 2021, the system will enforce default throttling. And what that means is, since there is no priority and the system has to maintain and preserve the system sanity, it will start throttling based on the first come first serve basis, which is whichever request comes in next. And if the system is unable to perform, or it thinks that it cannot perform because the system is already overutilized, then it will start throttling that request. So the request is, the plan is that for all of us to start playing with this ASAP when it is available, starting PU37, and learn and understand how that is happening, and also give us feedback, because we also want to take this time of between now and April to learn from all of your experiences, and if there is anything that is a real issue and we really want to know about that, and we can address that, so that by the time April comes, we have all gone through that process and nothing is surprising, and the throttling can be enabled in a smooth fashion. So that's the plan. And the other critical point is, we need to be connected all the time. I mean, these sessions are great for sharing information one way, but we absolutely want two-way, much more engaged, collaboration, so that we are able to respond to your concerns and the challenges that you are running into in enabling throttling, or any issues that you run into. We absolutely want to stay connected so that we are always here to help through the process. So for that, as most of you know, the data management and integrations Yammer group is quite active. And we've been sharing throttling on that forum for about 2 months now already. And many of you have given some good feedback, and that has been incorporated into the design as we were working through the development. So we want to continue to do that. And if you are not part of that group, then please join that group. And if you find trouble joining that group, then please do send one of us an email, and we will help you join that group. But that is the group where everyone collaborates, and you can share your concerns, give us feedback, and we are always active on that forum. So that is the call to action, and that is the plan for how throttling will be rolled out in a phased and throttled manner, if you will. Not like PU37 is coming in August and throttling will be enabled. No, it's not going to be that way. But we all have to work together to make sure that we are enabling it in a methodical and controlled manner, so that it doesn't affect our customers and our users negatively. So that's the plan, and that's what we wanted to share with all of you. So with that, we will open it up for Q&A. And Rahul, Haitham, any questions that you would want to read, then yeah, we can take it up. Haitham, can you switch to the next slide, please? So let's go through the published list of questions. We'll take it one at a time. So will this functionality work with finance and operations on-premise LBD? Yes, there is nothing in the design that is going to prevent this from working on LBD, unless when you validate and if you find any bugs, then please let us know. But to the best of our knowledge, it has been designed independently of whether it is LBD or a cloud deployment. The next question is throttling functionality D365 version specific? If yes, in which version is this available? I think Rahul answered that. Sorry, I should have seen that before. Let me go through this list. That is. James is asking a question. Are additional priority options being considered for enhancements? Example 0, 1, 2, and 9. No, James, that is not being considered. We specifically chose low, medium, high to keep it simple and not put the onus on you and other users of FNO and customers of FNO to decide what is the difference between 2 versus 3. So let's keep it simple as low, medium, high. That is a granularity that kind of works across the board. So that is what we went with. The next question, are there any plans to introduce a schedule for throttling? Example, throttle for users between 2 dates. That was discussed initially, but again, in the interest of keeping the functionality simple, we have refrained from making any scheduling based features for throttling. So right now there is no such schedule, but we want to learn from all of you. So give us feedback, and if that becomes like a critical component, then we can absolutely have discussions. Next question. Sorry, maybe I missed. Is there any way to view or define the thresholds? So that's an interesting question. So the thresholds cannot be viewed. The thresholds cannot be defined by users and customers. The threshold and its definition is part of the algorithm itself. It is part of the throttling engine itself. And that threshold definition can vary over time, will vary over time based on the learnings that we get from this going forward. So that is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is we really wanted to keep it simple from a user's perspective and not burden the user to think about specific resources, right? I mean, the user is not concerned about how much resource this is going to use, and the user should not be concerned about that, but instead the user should focus on the business side of things, which is these are the critical integrations for me, and this is the less critical integration for me. Let me configure that, and FNO will take care of it. So that is the approach we started with, and not to tax users to think about resources and get more technical into it. Next question, any plans to provide enable disable option per priority mapping grid entry? So if I can decipher that question, it is probably asking, can there be a pass through which is never throttle this integration? So I want to disable throttling on that. If that was the intent of the question, and if we understood that, then the answer is no. We want to be consistent across all integrations and not start providing options that will bypass throttling. So it will always be either low, medium, high priority. Is throttling only about integrations, or will it include applications within D365 such as retail point of sale if using something like MPOS? So I think the bottom line is any request that come, I mean, right now it is FNO focused, which means any request that comes into FNO, as long as it is an OData or a custom service request, regardless of from where it is coming, it is going to get throttled. Now, as far as taking this approach to other parts of the Dynamics family of products, I mean, that's something that we can, we will take a look at, but I think the first thing is for us to learn from this first initial release, and then we can, take the feedback, and then we can, go to the other scenarios, if you will. The next question, what happens to the request if user didn't retry the throttled request? Well, the request will fail. I mean, the response was given to the client as 429. So the request did not come into FNO for processing. And from a client's perspective, that request did not get completed because there was a 429. So if the client does not send the request back, then the request, I mean, that thing doesn't happen. I hope I understood the question and I answered it properly. And Haitham and Rahul, please chime in as well. An external application integration user may utilize several FNO integration services. Are there plans to enable setting priority per service? I mean, right now, the throttling is enabled for custom services and OData. So that's at the protocol level. There can be services, there can be several services that use OData and custom services from an implementation standpoint. So if the question is, can we configure throttling based on the scenario when you say service rather than protocol like OData? The answer is yes, it is going to be possible given what we demoed and given what will be there in PU37 as well, because the Azure Application ID is a parameter on which you can configure the priority. So if your integrations were designed as such where you have multiple Azure Application IDs created, either by scenarios or either by some criteria that you determine fit, then you have that flexibility to configure high, medium, low based on the app ID, which will translate to the criteria that you are interested in. And I think there was a similar question from someone else as well, and I hope this answer applies to that question also. Is there a way to increase the resource allocated to OData? That is, if there's a critical OData process that should take priority over D365 user performance. The last bit threw me off, but I'll try to answer the first part of it. I mean, like we discussed initially in the session, right? The resources are a common pool of resources. So, you know, the resources that OData needs is a common pool. So it is going to pick from that common pool of resource. So there is no way today to allocate dedicated resources to say OData, and only OData can use that set of resources. Instead, we can assign priority to make sure that high priority OData request gets the most share of the system resources that are available, unless and until the system is even going to tip off that high threshold value. So I hope that answers your question. What are the next questions? Sorry, I'm just scrolling through this list. Are there parameters to concurrently allocate number of processors and cores per priority? Rahul, do you want to take that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So the question from James is, are there parameters to concurrently allocate number of processors and cores per priority? Example, more processors for high priority and simultaneous less processors for low priority. I think it's all black box, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, I don't think, as Sunil mentioned in the beginning, the resources in the system are limited. So what we are trying to do is allocate resources to higher priority requests first before a lower priority request. So no, there is no dynamic allocation of higher cores or resources to higher priority. It will just happen by default within the constraints of the environment.
Right, and also the other aspect was to keep this simple from a user perspective. So the actual threshold, the definition of it, what all does it take into account, processors and cores and all of that. I mean, that's all well hidden inside the logic and the framework itself. So that from a user perspective, we really don't have to worry about all those, system aspect of it. As a SaaS service, we just have to focus on our business process and what is critical from a business perspective, and let the system do its thing. So that was the fundamental approach we took. The next question from Chris: is there a data entity to expose the priority mappings? If you needed a schedule, you could use a logic app flow to update the priorities based on requirements. I think that's a good feedback, Chris. Yeah, we will take that as a feedback to see how we can. Yeah, we have to process that a little bit, but I think I know what you are trying to say. So let's take that as a feedback, and we'll see what we can come up with. Question from Sai: how does throttling help when two or more concurrent OData API calls are made at the same time? So the throttling will help in different situations, right? So, I mean, it's a permutation and combination. So the concurrent requests that are coming in, they could be of different priority. For example, a low, medium, high comes at the same time. And if the system is below the threshold of low, all three will get in and they will be processed. But if the system had hit the low threshold already, then the low priority request will be sent back. The medium and high will come through. or if the system had hit medium already, the low and the medium will be sent back and high will be processed, and so on and so forth. So hope that answered the question. Let me scroll through. I'm trying to pick questions that has some votes on it over questions that doesn't have any votes. So that's why I'm kind of scrolling. Another question from Chris. Will this impact dual write integrations? The answer is no. It will not impact dual write integrations.
Sunil, I think I can take the next one.
Yep. Okay.
A question related to the sizing needs to be reassessed rather than continuing with a worsening throttling situation. So
Yep.
that's actually a good question, because again, throttling is not to enforce limits. Throttling is not to make sure that you use the infrastructure that you have. Definitely, as we start with an estimate, the actual usage, as Sunil mentioned, 9 out of 10, it will vary. And throttling is not to limit this. Throttling is just to preserve the system reliability, balancing between my critical integrations and my online users. And definitely, if we assess that at some point of time, there is a big variance between the actual usage and the initial size, definitely this has to be revisited. Another estimate has to be completed. And if we determine that this environment needs to be resized by scaling out or scaling up, definitely that would be the case.
Right. Thanks, Aitam.
Thanks.
Next, let's pick the next question. This question has 4 votes, so let's pick that. Will historic throttling information be used to advise on resizing of environments? I think that's a great question, and absolutely yes, right? Because this is the first step. The first step is for us to understand our workloads and understand how throttling has been happening. And that learning that information is what needs to tied up for discussions into how can we even prevent throttling. I mean, throttling is happening because something is wrong, right? I mean, the system either is not sized properly, or the business has grown and sizing needs to be relooked at, and Haitham touched upon that. So yes, absolutely. That is the intent, that we get into that methodical process based on data to have some some data-driven decisions, if you will. What's the next question? Question from Tarek. When you update the priorities, how long is it before the AOSs know they have changed? Rahul?
Right. I think it is. It's a few minutes. I don't remember the exact number, but it's going to be, I think, maybe a couple of minutes or something like that. But we can update that in the documentation.
Yeah. Are you guys seeing any other questions with a high number of votes? Then please feel free to bring that up. I'm scrolling here as well. I think we have covered almost all the questions in the published.
I think one of the questions is, will these Q&A be included in the Tech Talk recording for future reference?
Yeah, I'll. Rich or someone else? Nina, do you want to take that? Nina?
The questions will not be visible post-event. However, we do send them over to the presenters afterwards, and if you wanted to create an FAQ, that could be posted potentially. Just a thought.
Yeah, I think what we'll do is, yeah, there were so many questions. So to be quite honest, we probably have not taken notes and copied all the questions, but based on what we have responded and the theme of the questions, we'll take that and then we'll see if we can, create a FAQ in our public docs so that it will be useful for others as well. So yeah, we can certainly do that. Thanks for that.
And I would also strongly recommend to use the Yammer link because actually the questions we see here, like it's a great feedback and we like more. So at the end, our purpose is to provide the best experience for you guys. So please, if you can, just join the group. There is so many discussions. You can answer the questions. It's going to be visible by everyone, and it's going to help us, adjusting as we learn during the process. Thank you.
Okay, I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel, and we'd like your feedback on today's session and to hear what you'd like to see in future events. The survey scores are on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. Thank you for your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. This concludes today's web conference. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and audience for joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening.
Thanks all.